My name is Robert, and this is my wife Margaret. We're sitting here today, at ages 74 and 71 respectively, with hearts both heavy and hopeful. After 46 years as devoted Jehovah's Witnesses, we feel compelled to share our story, not out of bitterness, but out of love for families who might still have time to choose differently. Margaret's hands are folded in her lap, the same way she used to fold them during countless meetings at the Kingdom Hall. But today, there's a tremor in them that wasn't there when we were younger, when we were so certain about everything. Today, we speak with the weight of decades pressing on our shoulders, and the knowledge that some wounds may never fully heal. It was 1978 when we first encountered the Witnesses. Margaret was 25, I was 28, and we'd been married for just 3 years. We were living in a small apartment in Ohio, struggling to make ends meet, and frankly, struggling to find meaning in our lives. The world seemed chaotic. Vietnam was fresh in everyone's memory, the economy was uncertain, and we felt lost in the vastness of it all. Then came Sister Dorothy, knocking on our door on a crisp October morning. She was in her 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put us at ease. She carried with her a sense of purpose that we'd never encountered before, and when she spoke about God's kingdom coming to earth, about living forever in paradise, something inside both of us stirred with hope. "Would you like to study the Bible?" she asked, and before we knew it, we'd said yes. Those early study sessions were magical. Dorothy would arrive every Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock sharp, her leather Bible case in one hand and a stack of Watchtower publications in the other. She'd sit at our small kitchen table, and for 2 hours, she'd paint pictures of a world without suffering, without death, without the confusion that seemed to plague our daily lives. Margaret was drawn to the moral clarity. "Everything makes sense," she'd tell me after Dorothy left. "There are clear answers to every question. We don't have to wonder about right and wrong anymore." For someone who'd grown up in a household where her parents fought constantly and moral boundaries seemed fluid, this certainty was like water in a desert. I was attracted to the intellectual framework. The Witnesses had answers for everything. Why suffering existed, what happened when we died, how the Bible connected to modern times. The prophecies fascinated me, the way current events seemed to fit so perfectly into the biblical timeline they presented. It felt like being let in on the ultimate secret of the universe. Within 6 months, we were attending every meeting. The Kingdom Hall became our second home. We'd arrive early and stay late, soaking up every word from the platform. The brothers and sisters welcomed us with open arms, and for the first time in our adult lives, we felt like we belonged to something bigger than ourselves. The congregation became our family. Brother James took me under his wing, teaching me how to prepare talks for the Theocratic Ministry School. Sister Ruth showed Margaret how to organize her time for field service, how to dress appropriately, how to carry herself as a Christian woman. We made friends quickly. Real friends, we thought, who cared about our spiritual welfare above all else. Our baptism in 1979 was one of the happiest days of our lives. Standing waist-deep in that cold pool at the circuit assembly, with hundreds of brothers and sisters watching, we felt chosen. We felt special. We felt like we'd found our place in God's plan for humanity. The early years were filled with activity and purpose. We pioneered together, spending 90 hours a month going door to door, sharing the good news with anyone who would listen. We attended every meeting, Tuesday night book study, Thursday night Theocratic Ministry School and service meeting, Sunday Watchtower study and public talk. We never missed a circuit assembly or district convention. Our marriage strengthened during those early years. We had a common goal, a shared mission. Every decision we made was filtered through the lens of our faith. Where to live, what jobs to take, how to spend our free time, everything was organized around our service to Jehovah. It gave our relationship a focus that many of our worldly friends seemed to lack. We postponed having children, following the organization's subtle encouragement to focus on the preaching work in these last days. The new system was so close, we reasoned. Why bring children into this dying world when paradise was just around the corner? We threw ourselves into spiritual activities instead, finding fulfillment in Bible studies and shepherding calls. Margaret became particularly gifted at conducting Bible studies with interested women. She had a gentle way of explaining even the most complex doctrines, and several of her students progressed to baptism. I enjoyed giving talks from the platform and was eventually appointed as a ministerial servant. We felt like we were making a real difference in people's lives, helping them find the same truth and happiness we discovered. The social aspect of congregation life was wonderful. We attended wedding receptions that lasted until midnight, filled with wholesome entertainment and Christian fellowship. We organized picnics and game nights, where we could relax and enjoy each other's company without worrying about worldly influences. Our calendar was always full of spiritual activities and social gatherings with our brothers and sisters. We believed absolutely in everything the organization taught. When the Watchtower said that 1975 might bring Armageddon, we prepared excitedly. When that year passed without incident, we accepted the explanation that we'd simply been too eager. Our faith remained unshaken. If anything, the delayed expectations made us more determined to prove our loyalty. Those first 10 years were golden. We had purpose, community, and hope. We woke up every morning knowing exactly what we were supposed to do and why we were doing it. The future was clear and bright. Paradise was coming, and we were going to be there. Together. Looking back now, I understand why those years felt so fulfilling. When you're part of a high-control group, the initial experience can be intoxicating. The certainty, the belonging, the sense of being special, it meets deep human needs. But what we didn't realize then was that this golden period was also when we were slowly being isolated from the outside world and taught to distrust our own thoughts and feelings. As the 1980s progressed, our involvement deepened. I was appointed as an elder in 1983, a position that filled me with pride and responsibility. Margaret increased her pioneer hours and began assisting with the circuit overseer's visits. We were model witnesses, held up as examples to younger ones in the congregation. But with increased responsibility came increased pressure to conform. As an elder, I was expected to enforce the organization's rules without question. I sat on judicial committees, making decisions about people's spiritual lives based on Watchtower guidelines rather than my own conscience. When doubts occasionally surfaced, I pushed them down, reminding myself that Jehovah's organization knew best. The first major test came in 1985 when my younger brother Michael announced he was getting married, to someone who wasn't a witness. Michael had never shown interest in the truth, despite my many attempts to witness to him. His fiancée was a lovely Catholic girl named Sarah, and they were planning a traditional church wedding. The organization's position was clear. True Christians should not attend religious ceremonies in false religious buildings. The local elders counseled me that attending would be a compromise of my faith and could result in loss of privileges. Margaret and I agonized over the decision. Michael was my only sibling, and we'd been close growing up. "But it's his wedding," Margaret said one evening as we discussed it. "How can we not be there?" "It's in a Catholic church," I reminded her. "We can't participate in false religious activities. What kind of example would we be setting?" In the end, we chose loyalty to the organization over family. We sent Michael a gift and a letter explaining our decision, but we didn't attend his wedding. The hurt in his voice when he called afterward haunts me to this day. "I don't understand, Bob," he said. "It's just a building. I'm still your brother." Our relationship with Michael was never the same. Holidays became awkward because we couldn't celebrate Christmas or birthdays with his family. Gradually, we saw less and less of each other. When their daughter Emma was born, we visited once but found it difficult to connect with our niece because of the religious barriers we'd erected. Margaret's family presented similar challenges. Her sister Linda had married a Methodist minister, and family gatherings often included prayers or discussions that made us uncomfortable. We began declining invitations, using our meeting schedule as an excuse. Margaret's mother worried that we were becoming isolated, but we reassured her that we had plenty of fellowship with our spiritual family. The isolation wasn't just social, it was intellectual too. We were discouraged from reading literature that wasn't produced by the organization. Higher education was strongly discouraged as a worldly pursuit that could lead to spiritual weakness. I'd always been interested in history and science, but I learned to view secular sources with suspicion, checking everything against Watchtower teachings. When our nephew David graduated from high school and received a full scholarship to study engineering, we couldn't celebrate with the family. The organization taught that pursuing higher education showed lack of faith in the nearness of Armageddon. Instead of congratulating David, we felt sorry for him, believing he was making a spiritually dangerous choice. Margaret began experiencing what we now recognize as depression during this period, though we didn't call it that then. She'd have days where she couldn't get out of bed, where the simplest tasks seemed overwhelming. When she mentioned it to the elders' wives, they suggested she increase her field service hours and spend more time in prayer. Mental health professionals were viewed with suspicion. Surely Jehovah's organization provided all the help anyone needed. I noticed Margaret's struggles but didn't know how to help. The organization taught that Christians should be joyful, that depression was often a sign of spiritual weakness or lack of appreciation for Jehovah's blessings. Instead of seeking professional help, we prayed more, studied more, and tried to serve more. Margaret pushed through her dark days by forcing herself to go out in field service, believing that putting kingdom interests first would eventually cure her sadness. Our financial situation became strained during this period too. As an elder, I was expected to be available for meetings, judicial committees, and shepherding calls. This meant turning down overtime at work and passing up promotion opportunities that would have required travel or evening commitments. We told ourselves that Jehovah would provide, that putting kingdom interests first guaranteed his blessing. Margaret worked part-time as a secretary, but her pioneer schedule limited her availability. We lived paycheck to paycheck, often relying on the generosity of other witnesses when unexpected expenses arose. We convinced ourselves that our simple lifestyle was spiritually superior to our relatives' material pursuits, but privately, the financial stress took its toll. The social walls we'd built became more apparent as the years passed. Our non-witness friends gradually stopped inviting us to gatherings because they knew we'd either decline or attend with obvious discomfort. Margaret's friendships from before our conversion faded away entirely. My relationships with former work colleagues became strictly professional. We told ourselves this was evidence of our spiritual growth, that we were no part of the world, as Jesus commanded. But the truth was, we were becoming increasingly dependent on the organization for all our social, emotional, and intellectual needs. Without realizing it, we'd trapped ourselves in a closed system where questioning was discouraged and dissent was equated with spiritual weakness. The walls we'd built to protect our faith from worldly influences also kept us from seeing the harm our choices were causing, to our extended family, to our own emotional health, and eventually, to our children who would grow up inside these same walls. In 1987, when I was 37 and Margaret 34, we finally decided to have children. The new system hadn't arrived as quickly as we'd expected, and our desire for family had grown stronger than our concerns about bringing children into a dying world. We convinced ourselves that raising godly children would be another form of service to Jehovah. Our daughter Rebecca was born in March 1988, followed by our son David in 1991. From the moment they drew their first breaths, we knew their entire lives would be shaped by our faith. We were determined to raise them as exemplary witness children who would make Jehovah proud. Rebecca was a bright, curious child with an infectious laugh. David was more reserved but thoughtful, always asking penetrating questions that sometimes caught us off guard. We loved them fiercely and wanted nothing but the best for them, which, in our understanding, meant ensuring their place in the new system of things. Their childhood was structured around the organization's expectations. From infancy, they attended every meeting, sitting quietly through hours of instruction designed for adults. Rebecca learned to color silently during the Watchtower study. David mastered the art of taking notes even before he could fully read. Other parents in the congregation often commented on how well-behaved our children were. Birthday parties and Christmas celebrations were foreign concepts to our children. While their classmates talked excitedly about Santa Claus and birthday presents, Rebecca and David learned to explain why they didn't participate in such celebrations. They became adept at politely declining invitations to birthday parties, Halloween events, and holiday pageants. Margaret threw herself into their spiritual education with the same intensity she'd once brought to her pioneer work. Family study night was sacred in our household. Every Monday evening, we'd gather around the kitchen table with our Bibles and the latest Watchtower publication designed for families. We'd go through the material paragraph by paragraph, making sure the children understood each point. I took pride in preparing Rebecca and David for their parts on the Theocratic Ministry School. Rebecca gave her first talk at age 6, a simple presentation about why we don't celebrate birthdays. David's first talk, at age 7, explained the importance of regular meeting attendance. Other elders would compliment us on how articulate and spiritually mature our children were. But even then, there were signs of strain. Rebecca once asked why she couldn't attend her best friend's birthday party at school. "It's not fair," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I just want to be normal like everyone else." Margaret's response was gentle but firm. "Rebecca, sweetie, we're special. Jehovah has given us the truth, and that makes us different from other people. Sometimes being different is hard, but it's also a blessing." David's questions were more challenging. At age 8, he asked why dinosaurs existed if they weren't mentioned in the Bible. When I explained the organization's teaching about the creative days, he pressed further. "But Dad, if each creative day was thousands of years long, how did plants survive without the sun before the fourth day?" These moments required careful navigation. The organization taught that questioning was healthy as long as it led to acceptance of established truth. But persistent questioning that seemed to challenge fundamental teachings was viewed as spiritual weakness or even rebellion. I learned to redirect David's inquiries toward approved sources, always ending with the assurance that Jehovah's organization had the answers to every question. School became increasingly problematic as the children grew older. Rebecca struggled with the isolation that came from not participating in holiday celebrations, sports teams, or extracurricular activities. Her teacher once called to express concern that Rebecca seemed withdrawn and had few friends. "She's very intelligent," the teacher said, "but she doesn't seem to connect with the other children. And she becomes visibly uncomfortable during any celebration or when we discuss topics like evolution in science class." Margaret and I reassured each other that this was normal. Witness children often struggled socially because they had higher moral standards than their worldly peers. We increased our efforts to provide social opportunities within the congregation, organizing more activities with other witness families. David's academic abilities created different challenges. He excelled in every subject, particularly science and mathematics. His teachers regularly suggested advanced placement classes and began discussing college preparation when he was just in middle school. But we'd been clearly taught that higher education was spiritually dangerous, a pursuit that could lead children away from the truth. "The time left is reduced," we reminded ourselves, quoting the Apostle Paul. Why would we encourage David to spend 4 years in college when Armageddon could come at any moment? Instead, we began steering David toward practical skills that would serve him well in the new system. We talked about learning trades, about the value of working with one's hands. When he expressed interest in becoming a scientist, we gently redirected his attention toward spiritual goals. Perhaps he could become a ministerial servant while still young, or even pioneer after high school. Margaret's depression, which had improved somewhat after the children were born, began to worsen as the pressures of raising witness children in a non-witness world intensified. She felt constantly judged, by other mothers at school who couldn't understand our restrictions, by sisters in the congregation who seemed to handle everything effortlessly, and by her own mother who worried that we were being too strict with the children. "I feel like I'm failing everyone," she confided to me one evening after a particularly difficult day. Rebecca had come home in tears because she'd been the only child in her class who couldn't participate in the Halloween party. David had been asking increasingly challenging questions about Bible chronology that I couldn't answer to his satisfaction. "You're not failing," I assured her. "Raising children in the truth is the most important work we can do. These challenges are temporary. Once the new system comes, all of this will be worth it." But privately, I was beginning to feel the weight of responsibility too. As an elder, I was expected to have exemplary children who brought glory to the organization. Every stumble, every question, every moment of normal childhood rebellion was scrutinized through the lens of spiritual progress. Were we doing enough? Were we too strict? Too lenient? The pressure to produce perfect little witnesses was enormous. The children's relationship with their extended family became increasingly strained as they grew older. My brother Michael's daughter Emma was close in age to Rebecca, but the girls rarely saw each other. When they did, the differences in their upbringing were stark. Emma talked freely about movies we wouldn't allow our children to see, books we considered inappropriate, activities we deemed worldly. Margaret's family tried to accommodate our beliefs, but it became increasingly difficult. Her sister Linda's children played sports and participated in school plays, achievements that couldn't be celebrated in our presence. Family gatherings became tense affairs where everyone walked on eggshells, afraid of inadvertently bringing up topics that would make us uncomfortable. We told ourselves that this separation was necessary, even godly. The Bible said that following Christ would divide families, that true Christians would face opposition even from their own relatives. But watching our children miss out on relationships with their cousins, seeing the hurt in their grandparents' eyes when we couldn't participate in family traditions, these things weighed on us more than we admitted. The organization's social activities helped somewhat. Circuit assemblies and district conventions were exciting events for the children, opportunities to see friends from other congregations and feel part of something larger. Rebecca particularly enjoyed the dramas that illustrated Bible stories and moral lessons. David liked the careful organization and precise scheduling of these events. But as the children entered their teenage years, new challenges emerged. Rebecca began asking why she couldn't date until she was old enough to marry. David wondered why he couldn't participate in the science club at school if he wasn't going to pursue higher education anyway. These questions required increasingly complex explanations that relied more on organizational authority than logical reasoning. Margaret and I found ourselves having whispered conversations late at night, expressing concerns we couldn't voice publicly. Were we doing the right thing? Were our children happy? Were we preparing them for successful lives, or were we handicapping them in ways we didn't fully understand? But these doubts were always followed by guilt. The organization taught that such questioning was evidence of spiritual weakness, possibly even demonic influence. We'd pray for forgiveness for our doubts and renew our commitment to following organizational guidelines, no matter how difficult they seemed. Looking back now, I see that this period was when the cracks in our foundation began to show, even though we refused to acknowledge them. Our children were growing up isolated from the broader world, dependent on an organization that demanded unquestioning loyalty in exchange for promised future rewards. And we, their parents, were slowly losing touch with our own instincts about what was best for our family. The mid-1990s brought subtle but significant changes to our family dynamic. Rebecca was now 7 and showing signs of the intelligent, independent thinking that would later challenge everything we believed. David, at 4, was still young enough to accept our explanations without question, but even he was beginning to notice the differences between his life and those of his classmates. Margaret's depression had evolved into something more complex. She was functional. She attended meetings, participated in field service, maintained our household, but there was a heaviness about her that hadn't been there in our early years as witnesses. She'd spend long periods staring out the kitchen window, and I'd find her crying sometimes for reasons she couldn't articulate. "I just feel so tired," she'd say when I asked what was wrong. Tired of being different. Tired of explaining. Tired of feeling like we're always swimming against the current. As an elder, I was supposed to be the spiritual head of our household, the one with answers and unwavering faith. But privately, I was struggling too. The judicial committees I served on were becoming increasingly difficult. We disfellowship young people for normal teenage mistakes, breaking up families and destroying relationships in the name of maintaining congregation purity. One case particularly haunted me. Sister Martinez's 18-year-old son Carlos had been caught smoking marijuana with some worldly friends. He was genuinely repentant, tearful, and promised never to do it again. But the committee decided that his actions showed a pattern of association with bad companions and lack of respect for theocratic authority. We disfellowshipped him. I watched Sister Martinez's face crumble when we announced the decision. Carlos was her only child, and she was a single mother who'd joined the truth largely because of the promise that it would help her raise him right. Now she was told she couldn't even say hello to her own son until he was reinstated, a process that typically took at least a year and sometimes much longer. How is this loving? I found myself thinking as I drove home that night. But I pushed the thought away, reminding myself that Jehovah's standards were higher than human understanding. The organization knew best. It had to. Rebecca's questions were becoming more sophisticated and harder to dismiss. During one family study, we were reviewing the organization's teaching about the generation that wouldn't pass away before Armageddon came. The teaching had been adjusted several times during our years in the truth, and Rebecca had apparently been paying attention. "Dad," she said, looking up from her watchtower, "last year you said that the generation meant people who were alive in 1914. But now it says it means the generation of anointed ones. Did we have it wrong before?" I felt a flutter of panic. This was exactly the kind of question that could plant seeds of doubt if not handled carefully. "The organization receives progressive revelation," I explained, using the standard answer. "As we get closer to the end, Jehovah reveals more light on his purposes. But Rebecca wasn't satisfied. So we were teaching people something that wasn't true? What if we're wrong about other things too? Margaret shot me a warning look. This was dangerous territory. Rebecca, she said firmly, we don't question the faithful and discreet slave. They're the channel Jehovah uses to give us truth. Rebecca nodded obediently, but I could see the questions didn't go away. She was just learning not to voice them. David, meanwhile, was displaying a natural aptitude for mathematics and science that impressed his teachers but worried us. He'd come home excited about experiments they'd done in class, full of questions about how things worked. But many of his interests conflicted with organizational teachings. "Dad, we learned about evolution today," he announced one afternoon when he was 9. "Did you know that humans and chimpanzees share 98% of their DNA? Isn't that amazing?" I felt my stomach tighten. "David, you know that evolution is just a theory that scientists use because they don't want to believe in God. The Bible tells us that Jehovah created everything. But why would God make it look like everything evolved if it didn't? That seems confusing." These conversations were becoming more frequent and more challenging. David wasn't rebelling. He was genuinely curious about the world around him. But his curiosity was leading him to ask questions that the organization couldn't answer without circular reasoning or appeals to authority. Margaret began having what she later described as panic attacks during this period, though we didn't recognize them as such at the time. She'd suddenly feel overwhelmed during meetings, her heart racing and her breathing shallow. She'd have to step outside for air, telling concerned sisters that she was just feeling a bit warm. "Maybe you should see a doctor," I suggested after one particularly severe episode at the circuit assembly. But Margaret shook her head. "The elders say that if we're having problems, we should examine our spiritual routine first. Maybe I need to pray more, or spend more time in personal study." This was the organization's standard response to mental health issues. Physical ailments were acceptable reasons to seek medical help, but emotional or psychological struggles were viewed as spiritual problems requiring spiritual solutions. The idea that Margaret might need professional counseling or medication was seen as a lack of faith in Jehovah's ability to heal. Our financial situation remained precarious. My refusal to pursue advancement at work, which would have required missing meetings or compromising my spiritual priorities, meant our income stayed flat while our expenses grew. Rebecca needed new clothes as she grew, David required school supplies and occasional field trip fees, and our aging car needed constant repairs. Other families in the congregation seemed to manage better financially, and I sometimes wondered what we were doing wrong. Brother Johnson had started his own cleaning business and was doing well enough to pioneer while supporting his family. Sister Williams worked part-time but somehow always seemed to have money for new outfits and nice gifts for the circuit overseer's visits. Margaret began working more hours at her secretarial job, but this created new problems. She'd come home exhausted, barely able to prepare dinner before we had to leave for the Tuesday night book study. Thursday meetings became a marathon of rushing through homework with the kids, quick dinners, and arriving at the Kingdom Hall frazzled and unprepared. "I feel like I'm failing at everything," Margaret confided during one of our increasingly rare moments of honest conversation. "I'm not keeping up with my pioneer hours, the house is a mess, and I can barely stay awake during the meetings." But there was no acceptable solution within the organization's framework. Reducing meeting attendance wasn't an option. Cutting back on field service would mean losing pioneer status, which would reflect poorly on our spirituality. Working less would mean financial hardship that would also reflect poorly on my ability to provide for my family. We were trapped in a system that demanded perfection while providing no realistic way to achieve it. The turning point came in 1997, during a circuit overseer's visit. Brother Peterson was a kind man in his 60s who'd been traveling to congregations for over 20 years. During his private meeting with the elders, he asked about our families and how we were managing our responsibilities. I found myself being more honest than usual. "Sometimes I wonder if we're asking too much of our children," I admitted. "Rebecca seems stressed about not fitting in at school, and David asks questions I can't answer." Brother Peterson nodded sympathetically. "Brother Anderson, raising children in the truth has never been easy. But remember, we're living in the last days. These children may never graduate from high school in this system. Our job isn't to prepare them for worldly success, It's to prepare them for life in the new system. His words were meant to be encouraging, but they hit me like a physical blow. Never graduate from high school? We were talking about my 9-year-old son, my 7-year-old daughter. What if the new system didn't come as quickly as we expected? What if we were wrong about the timing, as we'd been wrong before? But I couldn't voice these doubts. As an elder, I was supposed to be a pillar of faith for others to lean on. Expressing uncertainty about the organization's teachings would be devastating to my position and potentially harmful to others' faith. That night, lying in bed next to Margaret, I stared at the ceiling and allowed myself to think forbidden thoughts. What if we were wrong? What if we were damaging our children by limiting their opportunities and isolating them from normal childhood experiences? What if Margaret's depression was being made worse by the constant pressure to be joyful and the prohibition against seeking professional help? These questions terrified me because I couldn't answer them using organizational publications. And if I couldn't answer them as an elder with 20 years of study and experience, what did that say about the foundation of our entire belief system? But morning came, and with it the familiar routine of meeting preparation, field service, and family study. The questions got pushed down again, buried under the weight of responsibility and the fear of what acknowledging them might mean for our family, our friendships, and our entire way of life. The cracks in our foundation were widening, but we weren't ready to examine them closely. Not yet. By the early 2000s, our children were becoming teenagers, and the pressures that had been building for years finally began to manifest in ways we could no longer ignore. Rebecca, now 14, had developed into a thoughtful, articulate young woman whose questions had evolved from curious to challenging. David, at 11, was displaying intellectual gifts that our faith community wasn't equipped to nurture. Rebecca's high school years were particularly difficult. She watched her classmates participate in activities that were forbidden to her, not just holidays and birthdays, but school dances, sports teams, drama club, and dating. The social isolation that had been manageable in elementary school became crushing during these formative years. I don't understand why showing school spirit at a pep rally is wrong, she said one evening after declining yet another invitation to a school event. I'm not worshiping anything. I'm just trying to have normal teenage experiences. Margaret's response reflected years of organizational conditioning. Rebecca, the world's activities might seem innocent, but they're designed to draw us away from spiritual things. Would Jesus have attended pep rallies? But I could see the toll this isolation was taking on our daughter. She'd come home from school quiet and withdrawn, spending hours in her room doing homework or reading. The bright, curious child who used to chatter excitedly about her day had become sullen and distant. Other parents in the congregation praised us for raising such a spiritually mature teenager, but I worried about the price of that maturity. David's situation was different but equally concerning. His science teachers had identified him as gifted and were pushing for him to be placed in advanced programs. They spoke of his potential for academic scholarships, of opportunities in research and technology. But we'd been clearly taught that higher education was spiritually dangerous. The end is so close, I reminded myself during parent-teacher conferences where David's potential was enthusiastically discussed. Why would we encourage him to pursue worldly achievements when paradise is just around the corner? But privately, I began to wonder, what if we were wrong about the timing? What if the end didn't come during David's youth, as we'd been led to expect? Were we limiting his potential based on predictions that had already proved incorrect multiple times? Margaret's depression had deepened significantly by this time. She'd stopped pioneering, citing health issues, but continued to struggle with meeting attendance and field service. The sisters in the congregation were kind but concerned, offering the standard spiritual remedies: more prayer, more study, more service to others. Maybe you should talk to Sister Williams, one well-meaning friend suggested. She went through a difficult period a few years ago, and increased meeting attendance really helped her mood. But Margaret wasn't just sad. She was experiencing clinical depression that manifested in physical symptoms, sleep disturbances, and an inability to find joy in activities she'd once loved. She needed professional help, not more meetings. However, seeking therapy was still viewed with suspicion in our community. What spiritual weakness was she harboring that Jehovah's organization couldn't address? The pressure to maintain appearances as an elder's family was enormous. We were expected to be exemplary in every way: our meeting attendance, our field service participation, our children's behavior, even our clothing and grooming. Other families looked to us as a model, and any sign of struggle was seen as a spiritual problem rather than normal human difficulty. I remember one particularly painful circuit assembly where the circuit overseer gave a talk about the importance of family heads taking the lead in spiritual activities. He used our family as an example, praising Margaret's former pioneer status and the children's meeting participation. As he spoke, I looked down at Margaret sitting beside me, her face a mask of polite attention while her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Rebecca was staring at the floor, and David was fidgeting with obvious discomfort. We were being held up as an example of success while privately falling apart. The breaking point came during David's 8th grade year. His counselor called to discuss high school course planning and mentioned that David had scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests. She was excited about the advanced placement classes he could take, the college preparatory track that would position him for academic success. David is exceptionally bright, she said. With proper guidance, he could earn scholarships to prestigious universities. Have you considered what you'd like him to focus on? I felt the familiar conflict between pride in my son's abilities and fear of encouraging worldly pursuits. We'll need to discuss that as a family, I said diplomatically. That evening, Margaret and I sat down with David to talk about his future. We explained the organization's position on higher education, the dangers of worldly wisdom, the importance of keeping our priorities straight in these last days. David listened quietly, then asked a question that cut to the heart of our dilemma. Dad, if the end is really as close as we've been told, why does it matter if I take hard classes or easy ones? And if it's not that close, shouldn't I be prepared for the future? I didn't have a good answer. The organization's position only made sense if Armageddon was imminent, but we'd been saying it was imminent for 25 years. How long could we keep postponing normal life decisions based on expectations that continued to be unfulfilled? Rebecca's questions had also evolved beyond what I could answer with organizational publications. She'd begun reading about the history of the Watchtower organization and had discovered information that contradicted what we'd been taught. She learned about failed prophecies, doctrinal changes, and policies that had harmed families. Dad, why didn't anyone tell us that the organization taught that the end would come in 1975? She asked one evening during family study. I found old magazines that talk about it all the time. I felt my stomach drop. This was information that was technically available but rarely discussed in modern publications. The organization preferred to focus on present truth rather than dwelling on past mistakes. The organization learned from that experience, I said carefully. Sometimes our eagerness for God's kingdom causes us to read more into the Bible than is actually there. But Rebecca pressed further. If they were wrong about something that important, how do we know they're right about everything else? What if we're wrong about shunning people or not going to college? Her questions echoed the doubts I'd buried years ago, and hearing them from my own daughter felt like a seismic shift. Margaret's face tightened, and I could see the fear in her eyes, not just fear of Rebecca's questions, but fear of what answering them might mean for our family, our faith, and our standing in the congregation. Rebecca's questions hung in the air like a storm cloud. For the first time, I couldn't dismiss them with a rehearsed answer from a Watchtower article. Her words forced me to confront the dissonance I'd been suppressing for years. Margaret, too, seemed shaken, her usual composure faltering as she looked to me for guidance I wasn't sure I could provide. Rebecca, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, Jehovah's organization is led by imperfect men, but it's still his channel. We trust that he'll correct any mistakes in his due time. She nodded, but her eyes told me she wasn't convinced. That night, as Margaret and I lay in bed, we barely spoke. The silence was heavy with unspoken fears. What if Rebecca was right? What if our blind loyalty was costing our children more than we could justify? David's questions continued to challenge us as well. His intellectual curiosity was insatiable, and he began bringing home books from the school library. Books on astronomy, biology, and philosophy. These were topics we'd been taught to approach with caution, as they often contradicted the organization's teachings. Yet, I couldn't bring myself to forbid him from reading them. His excitement was infectious, and deep down, I envied his freedom to explore ideas without the weight of doctrine. Margaret's health continued to deteriorate. Her panic attacks grew more frequent, and she began withdrawing from congregation activities. The sisters noticed, and their well-meaning but misguided advice only deepened her sense of failure. "Perhaps you need to simplify your life," one elder's wife suggested. "Focus on the basics: meetings, service, prayer." But Margaret was already stretched thin, and the suggestion that her struggles stemmed from spiritual weakness only deepened her despair. In 2001, a particularly painful incident brought our family's tensions to a head. Rebecca, now 15, was invited to a school dance by a classmate she liked. She knew dating was forbidden unless marriage was the immediate goal, but she pleaded with us to let her go, just this once. "It's not about dating," she insisted. "It's just a dance. I want to feel normal for one night." Margaret and I discussed it for hours. The organization's rules were clear. Attending such an event could lead to worldly associations and compromise her spiritual purity. But seeing the desperation in Rebecca's eyes, I felt a pang of guilt. Wasn't it enough that she was already missing out on so much? Why couldn't we give her this one small thing? In the end, we held firm, citing the need to protect her from worldly influences. Rebecca's response was unlike anything we'd seen from her before. She slammed her bedroom door and refused to speak to us for days. When she finally emerged, her demeanor had changed. The spark in her eyes was dimmer, replaced by a quiet resentment that frightened me more than her tears ever had. David, meanwhile, was grappling with his own struggles. His science teacher had encouraged him to enter a regional science fair, and he'd spent weeks preparing a project on planetary motion. When he won first place, he came home beaming, eager to share his achievement. But our response was tempered by years of conditioning. "That's wonderful, David," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "But you know that worldly recognition isn't what we're striving for. Your real reward will come in the new system." His face fell, and I saw something shift in him, a realization that his talents would always be secondary to the organization's priorities. I wanted to tell him how proud I was, to celebrate his achievement without reservation, but the words caught in my throat. How could I encourage his passion without betraying the faith we'd built our lives around? By 2003, our family was at a crossroads. Rebecca, now 16, had become increasingly distant, spending more time at school and less at home. She stopped participating in field service, citing homework and exhaustion, and her meeting attendance became sporadic. The elders noticed, and I was called into a meeting to discuss her spiritual health. "Brother Anderson," one elder said, his tone gentle but firm, "your daughter seems to be struggling. Have you considered increasing your family study time? Perhaps she needs more encouragement to associate with the friends in the congregation." I nodded, promising to address the issue, but inside, I was torn. Rebecca wasn't struggling with her faith, she was questioning it outright. And the more I tried to steer her back to the organization's teachings, the more she pulled away. One evening, she confronted us with a directness that left us speechless. "I don't think I believe this anymore," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I've been reading about the organization's history, and there are so many things that don't add up. The failed prophecies, the shunning, the way we're supposed to ignore science. It feels wrong." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I felt a surge of panic, but also a strange sense of recognition. Rebecca was voicing the doubts I'd buried for decades. I wanted to argue, to defend the truth, but my heart wasn't in it. Instead, I asked, "What do you want to do, Rebecca?" "I want to go to college," she said. "I want to learn about the world without being afraid of it. I want to make my own choices." The words hit like a physical blow. College was the ultimate taboo, a path that could lead to disfellowshipping if pursued without the organization's approval. Margaret began to cry, and I felt my own eyes burn with tears, not just for Rebecca, but for the realization that our family was fracturing under the weight of our beliefs. David, now 13, was watching this unfold with quiet intensity. He'd always been close to Rebecca, and her rebellion seemed to embolden him. A few weeks later, he announced that he wanted to join the school's astronomy club. "It's not about rejecting Jehovah," he said. "I just want to learn about the universe he created." His logic was sound, but it didn't matter. The organization viewed such activities as distractions from spiritual priorities. Margaret and I were caught between our love for our children and our loyalty to the organization. We tried to reason with them, to explain why their desires were dangerous, but our arguments sounded hollow even to us. The congregation's response was swift. Rebecca's withdrawal from spiritual activities was seen as a warning sign, and the elders began to monitor our family more closely. I was quietly removed from certain privileges, like giving public talks, as a subtle reminder that my family's spiritual state reflected on my qualifications as an elder. Margaret's mental health reached a breaking point. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting, she collapsed in tears in the car. "I can't do this anymore," she sobbed. "I'm trying so hard to be a good wife, a good mother, a good witness, but it's killing me." I held her, my own heart breaking. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that the organization might be wrong. Not just about minor details, but about the very foundation of our lives. I began researching online, cautiously at first, using a private browser to avoid detection. What I found shook me to my core. Stories of other witnesses who'd left, accounts of organizational cover-ups, and evidence of doctrinal inconsistencies that went far beyond what Rebecca had discovered. By 2005, our family was in crisis. Rebecca, now 17, had applied to colleges in secret, using her school counselor's help to navigate the process. When she was accepted to a state university with a partial scholarship, she told us with a mix of defiance and fear. "I'm going," she said. "I love you both, but I need to do this for myself." Margaret and I were devastated, but we couldn't bring ourselves to stop her. The organization would have expected us to shun her if she pursued higher education and drifted from the faith, but the thought of cutting off our daughter was unbearable. Instead, we told her we loved her and would always be there for her, even as the congregation began to distance themselves from us. David, inspired by his sister's courage, began openly pursuing his interests in science. He joined the astronomy club and started talking about a career in astrophysics. His teachers were thrilled, but the congregation was not. We were counseled repeatedly about the dangers of allowing our children to pursue worldly goals, and the pressure to conform became suffocating. My own research had led me to a point of no return. I discovered forums where former witnesses shared their experiences, detailing the emotional and psychological toll of leaving the organization. I read about the 1975 prophecy in depth, learning how thousands of witnesses had sold their homes and quit their jobs in anticipation of Armageddon, only to be left disillusioned when it didn't come. I found court documents related to child abuse cases that the organization had mishandled, protecting perpetrators while silencing victims. The more I learned, the angrier I became, not just at the organization, but at myself for ignoring the signs for so long. Margaret, too, began to question, though her journey was slower and more painful. Her depression had been exacerbated by the constant pressure to be perfect, and the realization that the organization might not be God's chosen channel was both liberating and terrifying. In 2006, we made the agonizing decision to stop attending meetings. It wasn't a dramatic exit. We simply faded away, citing health issues and family responsibilities. The congregation tried to reach out at first, but when it became clear we were no longer active, most of our friends stopped contacting us. The social isolation we'd imposed on ourselves for decades was now imposed on us by the very community we'd once called family. Rebecca left for college that fall, and we helped her move into her dorm, a bittersweet moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter for her, and for us. David continued to excel in school, and we encouraged his passions without reservation, even as we mourned the years we'd spent stifling them. The years that followed were a time of rebuilding and rediscovery. Margaret began therapy, something we'd never considered during our witness years. With professional help and medication, she slowly began to reclaim her sense of self. The guilt and shame that had weighed her down for so long began to lift, replaced by a cautious hope. I threw myself into learning, reading books on history, science, and philosophy that I'd avoided for decades. I reconnected with my brother Michael, apologizing for the years we'd been distant. He welcomed us back with open arms, and we began rebuilding relationships with our extended family, including our niece Emma and Margaret's sister Linda. Rebecca thrived at college, majoring in sociology and developing a passion for social justice. She visited often, and our conversations were no longer constrained by doctrinal boundaries. David pursued his love of science, eventually earning a scholarship to study astrophysics at a prestigious university. But the scars of our 46 years as witnesses remained. We mourned the lost time with family, the opportunities we denied ourselves and our children, and the relationships destroyed by shunning. We struggled with the guilt of having raised our children in a system that limited their freedom and caused them pain. Today, at ages 74 and 71, Margaret and I are at peace with our decision to leave, but the journey hasn't been easy. We found new purpose in sharing our story, hoping to help others who might be questioning their own beliefs. We're not angry at the witnesses. Many of them are sincere, loving people trapped in the same system we were. Instead, we feel a deep sadness for the years we lost and a fierce determination to live our remaining years with authenticity and love. We've learned that truth isn't confined to one organization or doctrine. It's found in the messy, beautiful complexity of human experience, in the questions we ask, the doubts we embrace, and the love we share with those who matter most. Our greatest regret is not that we believed, but that we let our belief blind us to the harm we were causing ourselves and our children. Our greatest hope is that our story might help others avoid the same mistakes.